It's Monday, March 7th, 2022. I'm Joshua Claycamp, and this is The Word and Observer, a Canadian look at God's Word while pondering the times in which we live and asking the Lord how Christians need to think and feel about current events. Theologian and noted scholar of law H.B. Hartman once said, "Truly, man is fearfully and wonderfully made. He is a wonder to angels, a wonder to the universe, and he ought to be a wonder to himself. Indeed, the wreck of the whole world is a disaster less shocking and less dreadful than the eternal ruin and loss of such a being." Indeed, this needs to be the Christian's focus as we continue to consider events out of Europe, as Russia continues its war against the sovereignty and the independence of Ukraine. No matter how we might try to ignore it or turn our focus upon other matters, news from Ukraine simply will not let us go. And as Christians, we need to continue to think about what a Christian response to these developments needs to be. The United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson published an essay in the New York Times over the weekend. He writes, quote, "Over the past week, in response to the gut-wrenching scenes in Ukraine, Western unity has been impressive and heartening. I know from my near daily conversations with President Volodymyr Zelensky that this has provided Ukrainians with some comfort in their hour of need." Now Boris Johnson goes on to describe the effect that Vladimir Putin's actions have had on the West. He writes, quote, "Never in my life have I seen an international crisis where the dividing line between right and wrong has been so stark as the Russian war machine unleashes its fury on a proud democracy. Russia's reckless attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant reminds us just how grave the stakes are for everyone. More than 1 million people have fled the violence toward an uncertain future. President Biden has displayed great leadership, consulting and convening allies, exposing the lie that America's commitment to Europe is somehow diminished. The European Union has undertaken a remarkable effort to align behind severe sanctions on Russia. Dozens of European countries are sending defensive equipment to Ukraine's armed forces." Now it's at this point that Prime Minister Johnson pauses after having considered all that the West and that America has done so far in order to unite against Vladimir Putin. It's at this point that Boris Johnson pauses and he asks a very pivotal question, which I think we need to be asking ourselves as well. He writes, quote, "But have we done enough for Ukraine?" The honest answer is no. As Christians, we need to step back and we need to ask ourselves that exact question. Have we done enough? More significantly, what would God have us to do? What more, apart from the humanitarian aid and the economic sanctions and the disbursement of lethal munitions to Ukraine, ought Christians to support? Boris Johnson goes on to say, quote, "The truth is that Ukraine had no serious prospect of NATO membership in the near future, and we were ready to respond to Russia's stated security concerns through negotiation. I and many other Western leaders have spoken to Mr. Putin to understand his perspective. The United Kingdom even sent emissaries to Moscow before Russia's invasion to deal directly with Defense Minister General Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, who are spearheading this awful campaign." Boris Johnson then goes on to say, quote, "It is now clear diplomacy never had a chance. There can be no comparison with the assault on Ukraine. There can be no comparison with the assault on Ukraine, we in the United Kingdom know something of Mr. Putin's ruthlessness. 4 years ago, we endured the outcome of Russian operatives' use of chemical weapons against people in Salisbury, England, and our allies rallied to our side. In our Defense and Foreign Policy Review, published a year ago, we warned that Russia remained the most acute security threat, and we announced the biggest increase in our defense spending since the end of the Cold War. We also warned that the world was entering into a period of competition in which authoritarian states would test the mettle of the West in every domain. Last year's agreement among the United Kingdom, America, and Australia to help deploy nuclear submarines for the Australian Navy demonstrated our shared resolve to meet the challenges we face in the Indo-Pacific. Boris Johnson then goes on to make this stunning statement. We have failed to learn the lessons of Russian aggression. For too long, we have turned the other cheek. No one can say we were not warned. We saw what Russia did in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine in 2014, and even on the streets of Salisbury. And I know from speaking to my counterparts on recent visits to Poland and Estonia just how acutely they feel the threat. In this op-ed for the New York Times, Boris Johnson goes on to say that there are several things that Western countries need to begin doing in concert with the European Union to ratchet up the pressure on Russia. He lays out a 6-point plan. He starts off by saying that we, quote, we must continue to mobilize an international humanitarian coalition. Second, Boris Johnson says, quote, we must do more to help Ukraine defend itself. And by more, what he means is there need to be more nations who are willing to provide defensive and lethal armaments to Ukraine. Third, he goes on to say, quote, we must maximize the economic pressure on Mr. Putin's regime. And this tends to be the standard response that most countries are willing to put forth. Economic pressure, sanctions, a boycotting of Russian goods and services, an attempt to shut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system that the rest of the banking world uses in order to process payments from one banking institution to the next. Boris Johnson says, quote, we must go further on economic sanctions, expelling every Russian bank from SWIFT and giving our law enforcement agencies unprecedented powers to peel back the facade of dirty Russian money in London. We must go after the oligarchs. So far, the United Kingdom has imposed sanctions on more than 300 elites and entities, including Mr. Putin himself. But these measures will be insufficient unless Europe begins to wean itself off the Russian oil and gas that bankroll Mr. Putin's war machine. Will this actually stop Putin, I wonder? What if it might be necessary in order to go to war, in order to defend Ukraine? Prime Minister Boris Johnson lays out a series of basic sanctions, a series of humanitarian efforts, and he calls, of course, for the further armament of Ukraine. But what if these attempts do not deter Russia? He concludes his essay by saying, quote, we must act now to strengthen Euro-Atlantic security. This includes not only bolstering NATO's eastern flank, but also supporting non-NATO European countries that are potentially at risk of Russian aggression, such as Moldova, Georgia, and the nations of the Western Balkans. And those that participate or enable Russian aggression, such as Belarus, should be subject to continued maximum sanctions. Now, as Christians, we're pondering the question, what if this isn't enough? What does God's word say in regards to the Christian's consideration of perhaps war? What does the Bible say about justification for war? One of the most basic responsibilities of government is to punish those who do evil. When a government does this, it defends the weak and the defenseless, and it deters further wrongdoing. The Apostle Peter says the civil government is intended, quote, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. This is from 1 Peter 2:14. Additionally, Paul says that the government is authorized by God to, quote, bear the sword, Romans 13:4, against evildoers so that it can be a terror to bad conduct and that it also carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. According to Paul, when the ruler uses superior force, even deadly force, against evil, he is, quote, God's servant for your good. Now, if a government is commanded by God to protect its citizens from the robber or the thief who comes from within the country, then certainly it also has an obligation to protect its citizens against thousands of murderers or thieves who come as an army from somewhere outside of the nation. Therefore, a nation has a moral obligation to defend itself against foreign attackers who would come to kill and conquer and subjugate the people of that nation. Note that I said foreign attackers. When we begin to consider the question of whether or not countries need to be coming to each other's aid and declaring war through military alliances on other countries, these are questions which we must weigh carefully. And so, as we look to the Christian tradition, we have to ask ourselves the question, what have theologians over the past centuries considered to be a just cause for war? How can we tell if a war is right or wrong, whether or not our country needs to go to war in intervening in a dispute between two other countries. During centuries of ethical discussions regarding the question of war, one common viewpoint that has developed, with much input from Christian scholars over time, is the just war tradition. That viewpoint argues that a war is morally right or just when it meets certain criteria. It also argues that there are certain moral restrictions in the way that war ought to be conducted. And it seems to me that this just war tradition, in general, is consistent with what the Bible teaches about the need for nations to defend themselves and their allies against enemies. Over time, the just war ethic has developed a common set of criteria. These include the following: just cause. In other words, is the reason for going to war a morally right cause, such as the defense of a nation? Second, competent authority. In other words, has the war been declared not simply by a renegade band within a nation, but is that war declared by a recognized competent authority within the nation that has the broad support of the citizens of that nation? Third, comparative justice. It should be clear that the actions of the enemy are morally wrong, and there can be no question in this case that the invasion of Russia into Ukraine constitutes a breach of God's moral law. Although Putin has given justifications, all Western analysts and all scholars of history have looked upon his justifications as mere propaganda for him to continue in his war of hostility and aggression against Ukraine. Fourth, right intention. The question of the heart matters. Is the purpose of going to war to protect justice and righteousness rather than simply to rob and pillage and destroy another nation? Fifth, last resort. Have all other reasonable means of resolving the conflict been exhausted? Sixth, and this is crucial for our consideration, is there a probability of success in going to war? Is there a reasonable expectation that the war can be won? And this is where the Western powers have struggled. This is where particularly President Biden and the United States have deliberated. Is it right to go to war as a nuclear power against another country that also possesses nuclear armaments? If the probability of success seems slim, then it appears from Christian teaching that the point almost becomes moot. Will the evil that is perpetrated be greater than any success that might come as a result of the war? Jesus seems to touch on this in Luke chapter 14, verses 28 to 31. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, Jesus asks, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, Jesus teaches, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, quote, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Verse 31 of Luke 14. Or, what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not first sit down and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000. In considering whether or not to declare war against Russia, the question must be asked and seriously analyzed and scrutinized amongst politicians and all other duly elected authorities within the government. If it is prudent to go to war against a nuclear country, considering the possibility that that war might escalate to the use of nuclear armaments, and what might the horror of those nuclear armaments mean for the devastation and the destruction of all the countries involved. The seventh consideration in terms of just war is the proportionality of projected results. That's a fancy term, but essentially the question is, will the good results that come from a victory in war be significantly greater than the harm and the loss that will inevitably come with pursuing that war? And that ties in with question 6, the probability of war. Now again, as we've been looking at these issues, We began our podcast today posing the question, do we appreciate the value of human life? Again, H.B. Hartman, that famous theologian, said that the destruction of the whole world is a disaster less shocking and less dreadful than the eternal ruin and loss of a single human being. In weighing these decisions, it is important that as we think about the safety and the security and the stability of our own countrymen, that we do not do so with disregard for the lives and the well-being of Ukrainians. There are not necessarily easy answers to these questions, and I don't know that I necessarily am offering a single path forward. But as we weigh and as we wrestle with these different considerations, we need to see the whole picture. Whether or not the West should go to war with Russia, whether or not it is right for us to come to the military defense of Ukrainians, will need further deliberation and further consideration. But as we do so, we have to wrestle with the fact that the Ukrainians are human beings just like us, created in the image of God and loved by Him, that they are indeed marvelous, marvelous people, deserving of life, deserving of liberty, and above all, their lives must be held sacred that we may be able to present the gospel, not only out of a desire for them to have life now, but to have it abundantly for all of eternity. All of these questions will need to be considered and deliberated, not only amongst politicians, but amongst Christians as well. But next, we come to a bit of a fun article, this published in The Guardian over the weekend by Bronwyn Adcock. The article is titled, Meet the Superhumans, essentially an essay detailing the dives of deep free divers, a new sport gaining in popularity. I am drawn to this article because it shows the remarkable and amazing way in which God has created us. Bronwyn begins, quote, 10 years ago, Australian Amber Bork was in her early 20s and backpacking through Egypt when she discovered something astonishing about herself. In a little village on the Sinai Peninsula, she came across a place that taught free diving, underwater diving without any breathing apparatus, and she decided to give it a try. Quote, I held my breath for 4 minutes and I dove to 18 meters, says Bork, who is the current women's Australian pool and depth free diving champion. Quote, both of those things I just didn't realize was possible. Bork had been a champion synchronized swimmer when she was a teenager, so she already knew she could hold her breath for several minutes at a time. But discovering freediving, quote, just opened my eyes to the possibilities, and I just got hooked on a feeling of diving deeper and wanted to see what I was capable of and how deep I could go, end quote. And this indeed compels us to take a look at ourselves, to take a look at human beings as created in the image of God. Indeed, as the scriptures say, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and learning about the world around us requires a degree of intelligence, a degree of sophistication, and moral reasoning that only come to us because of the Heavenly Father who bestowed those gifts to us. Indeed, as we explore the world around us, a part of that involves exploring our own bodies, these amazing contraptions which God has given us, which He intelligently designed for us, and through which we now learn we're capable, some of us at any rate, of diving to enormous depths. The article continues, quote, considered one of the most challenging forms of the sport, a diver descends vertically in deep water on a single breath, using only muscle strength to propel them downwards. With every meter of descent, the compressive pressure on the body increases, shrinking the spaces that contain air. By 30 meters down, the maximum depth physiologists in the early days of the sport thought humans were capable of reaching, the pressure exerted on the body is 4 times greater than on the surface, and the volume of air inside the body has shrunk to 1/4. Once negative buoyancy is achieved, the diver begins free fall, end quote. In other words, there's no longer a need at a certain depth to continue to swim downwards, as you are now in equalized water in terms of density, and your body will just begin to fall. as a result of gravity pulling you down. The article goes on, quote, Bork reached a depth of 73 meters. Now let's just pause there for a second. How far down is 73 meters? A meter is slightly more than 3 feet, but if we just do basic math, 73 times 3, we're talking over 210 feet down. That's quite deep, quite an achievement. The article goes on, Bork reached a depth of 73 meters, a world record, but a split-second blackout once she reached the surface disqualified her. Now, it's right there that we have to pause and say to ourselves, what kind of a sport is this where you dive so deep that you might actually die, and upon surfacing, the sudden rush of air into one's lungs could cause a momentary blackout? The article goes on, quote, if you stay underwater long enough, there's always the chance that your oxygen will drop to a level where your brain will decide to shut down in order to protect itself from damage, Bork says. Quote, so in a way, it's a good thing, but frustrating at the end of a long dive. Now that is quite remarkable. As Bork is recounting her events free diving, this new sport gaining in popularity, a bit of an extreme sport, she can't help but touch on the fact that her body still has an autonomic protection that it'll engage in order to preserve her brain, to preserve her organs, to continue to protect herself from herself. And as I'm sitting here reading this article, and as you're undoubtedly thinking the question at home, what in the world compels a person to dive so deep, but more importantly, how is such a thing even possible? How many minutes are they needing to hold their breath as they dive? How do they pull all of this oxygen out of the air in their lungs? Well, the article goes on to detail some of the physiological changes that are necessary over time. The article says, quote, primarily, the ability to survive while submerged for a prolonged time is a learned skill. According to Bain, who is a physiologist at the University of Windsor in Canada, studies suggest that elite freedivers have, quote, enhanced their mammalian dive response. He goes on to say that this is theorized to be an evolutionary adaptation, a vestige from billions of years ago when all life was aquatic. And of course, as Christians, we dismiss these types of theories as pure fiction and unproved, unsubstantiated. He goes on to say, quote, it's a reflex that's triggered when a mammal's face comes into contact with the water. It prompts a number of physiological responses that promote survival, such as the slowing of the heart rate and metabolism and a redirection of blood to vital organs, including to the lungs, to bolster them against the increased pressure. The major adaptation, though, is psychological. Developing a conscious ability to withstand the urge to breathe. According to Bain, an untrained person starts to undergo, quote, involuntary breathing movements, boy, I'll say, after no longer than 2 or 3 minutes underwater when the body, quote, has barely desaturated its oxygen, end quote. Elite freedivers, however, are able to mentally push through this point, holding their breath until they, quote, majorly desaturate their blood of oxygen, end quote. In other words, what the article is suggesting is that the ability to go deep to, say, 210 meters is something which must be learned through discipline and repetition. That while it is true that your body will undergo physiological changes, most significantly, we'll have to prepare ourselves psychologically. Not everyone is capable of diving that deep, but for those who do, they have to learn how to think through the automatic responses of their body and be able to control their body with their minds. All of this is just absolutely amazing to me, which brings me back to where we started. The human being is truly, fearfully, and wonderfully made as it is created in the image of God. As our theologian H.B. Hartman once said, he is a wonder to angels, a wonder to the universe, and he ought to be a wonder to himself. Indeed, the wreck of the whole world is a disaster less shocking and less dreadful than the eternal ruin and loss of such a being. And indeed, this needs to be our perspective as well as we consider people around us. They are created in the image of God, and they are worthy of love because He, their Creator, loves them. Thanks for listening to The Word and Observer. You can follow me on Twitter by going to twitter.com/Joshua Claycamp. If you're looking for a church where God is worshipped and people are loved, you can find more information about First Baptist Church of Kamloops at www.firstbaptistkamloops.org, or for more information on First Baptist Classical Academy, where we strive to educate kids according to a Christian worldview, just go to www.firstbaptistclassical.org. I'll meet you again tomorrow for the Word